The autumn fete at Street Mary Mead proceeded with its customary blend of gentle rivalry and charitable purpose, the kind of afternoon where the most pressing concern should have been whether Mrs. Bantry's preserves would again triumph over Miss Hartnell's formidable marmalade. Bunting fluttered cheerfully above the village green, and the scent of fresh scones mingled with the earthy sweetness of late roses from the vicarage garden. Miss Jane Marple sat beside her usual stall, needles clicking softly as she observed the familiar choreography of village life. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, noted everything. Colonel Melchett's nephew, Timothy, sulking by the coconut shy. Mrs. Price Ridley's new companion, the nervous Miss Greenshaw, who kept apologizing for imaginary transgressions, and most particularly Inspector Geoffrey Vane of Scotland Yard, whose presence had caused considerable flutter among the ladies. Inspector Vane had arrived 3 days prior, ostensibly for a brief holiday at the Lamb and Flag. However, Miss Marple's keen understanding of human nature suggested otherwise. The inspector's eyes held the focused intensity of a man pursuing official business, not the relaxed contentment of someone seeking rural respite. Dr. Haydock had mentioned, quite casually over tea, the recent spate of peculiar thefts in neighboring villages, valuable items vanishing from country houses during social gatherings, leaving no trace save their absence. Quite the coincidence, Miss Marple had murmured to herself while arranging her jam jars, a Scotland Yard inspector taking his holidays precisely where such mysteries abound. The inspector moved through the crowd with practiced charm, purchasing raffle tickets from Mrs. Bantry, sampling the vicar's wife's seed cake, and engaging in seemingly idle conversation. Yet Miss Marple observed how his attention lingered on certain individuals. Young Dr. Finch's artistic wife, Clara, who seemed unusually animated in conversation with the visiting painter, Mr. Julian Thorne. The precise solicitor, Mr. Endicott, whose nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles had become more pronounced, and Mrs. Evelyn Tremaine, whose sharp wit often concealed deeper currents. The afternoon wore on peacefully until 4:30, when Inspector Vane excused himself from a discussion about prize dahlias and wandered toward the small copse that bordered the green. Admiring the bluebells, he'd mentioned to Mrs. Bantry, though the season for bluebells had long passed. 20 minutes later, young Timothy Fortescue came running from the trees, his face white as chalk, stumbling over words that made no immediate sense. Inspector Vane. Something's happened. Dr. Haydock reached the scene first, his medical bag already in hand. The inspector lay motionless among the faded autumn leaves, positioned against an ancient oak with unnatural precision. A significant head wound suggested violence, though the absence of blood on the tree bark itself raised immediate questions about the circumstances. Tragic accident, Colonel Melchett pronounced, though his voice carried little conviction. The positioning seemed too deliberate, too carefully arranged among the fallen leaves. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic unobtrusive manner, her knitting bag clutched firmly. While others speculated about unfortunate mishaps and tragic falls, she noted the small details others overlooked. The inspector's notebook, conspicuously absent from the jacket pocket where she had observed it earlier, the peculiar cleanliness of his shoes, despite the muddy woodland path, and most tellingly, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering near the body, a fragrance she had noticed on someone else entirely during the afternoon's festivities. Such a pity, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who was being administered smelling salts. He seemed so interested in our little community. As constables arrived from Much Benham, Miss Marple retreated to her jam stall, continuing to serve customers with unruffled composure. But her mind was far from preserves and charitable causes. Inspector Vane's death was no accident, and whatever he had discovered had made his silence permanently necessary. As dusk settled over Street Mary Mead, the fate's cheerful remnants, seemed grotesquely inappropriate against the gravity of Inspector Vane's death. Bunting fluttered forlornly in the evening breeze while constables cordoned off the cops with methodical efficiency. The villagers dispersed reluctantly, each carrying fragments of shock and speculation that would fuel countless conversations through the night. Miss Marple found herself shepherded to the vicarage drawing room by the vicar's wife, where hot tea appeared with admirable promptness. The room quickly became a clearinghouse of theories and indignation. Mrs. Bantry, recovering her composure with remarkable speed, declared she had always sensed something would happen. "Such a purposeful man," she observed. "Not at all like someone on holiday. And those questions about our local artists most peculiar for casual conversation." Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to be outdone, proclaimed herself unsurprised by the tragedy. "These Scotland Yard types," she sniffed, "always poking about where they shouldn't. Mark my words." He discovered something unsavory and paid the price. The solicitor, Mr. Endicott, cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his spectacles twice in rapid succession. "We mustn't speculate," he insisted, though his voice carried little conviction. "Colonel Melchett has matters well in hand." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her mild blue eyes observing everything while appearing to focus on nothing in particular. "Speculation is so often unhelpful," she murmured gently. "Yet people cannot help comparing one thing with another. I always think of my nephew Raymond's friend, who seemed to stumble in the garden. Only, it transpired, he had been struck by a jealous rival over a business matter. Clara Finch, Dr. Haydock's artistic wife, moved restlessly between window and chair, her usual reserved demeanor replaced by nervous energy. "We were all here the entire afternoon," she announced suddenly. Her laugh pitched unnaturally high. "The cake stall bears witness to my imprisonment." The visiting painter Julian Thorne sat apart, staring at his paint-stained fingers with peculiar intensity. "The inspector spoke to me about light and shadow," he said flatly. Odd conversation for a policeman. He seemed particularly interested in the cops mentioned, wanting somewhere quiet for reflection. Mrs. Evelyn Tremaine arrived fashionably late, removing her gloves with feline precision. "What a bore," she murmured, and just when the raffle was becoming interesting. Her pearl clasp sat slightly askew, Miss Marple noted, though Mrs. Tremaine was typically meticulous about her appearance. The arrival of Superintendent Harper from Much Benham brought welcome authority to the proceedings. A methodical man with shrewd eyes, he listened patiently to the assembled theories before requesting individual statements. When questioned about Inspector Vane's purpose in Street Mary Mead, Harper remained diplomatically non-committal, though his expression suggested the inspector's presence had been far from coincidental. Dr. Haydock, having completed his preliminary examination, spoke carefully of the head wound's severity while avoiding speculation about its cause. "He was moved after the injury," he confided quietly to Harper. "The positioning seems quite deliberate." Miss Marple rose to leave, pleading the evening chill, and collected her knitting bag. As she passed Mr. Endicott's chair, that same expensive cologne she had noticed earlier lingered in the air, amber-scented and distinctly masculine, quite different from the village barber's simple bay rum. The memory crystallized. That same fragrance, when someone had drawn a raffle ticket from her jar, their hand brushing hers with casual familiarity. Walking home through the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's events. Inspector Vane had been conducting an investigation, of that she felt certain. His notebook was missing. His careful positioning among the leaves suggested theatrical intent, and someone in their peaceful village possessed both motive and opportunity for murder. "Such a pity," she murmured to herself, "when people forget how very much one notices while selling jam and observing human nature." The stage was set for a most intriguing investigation. The morning after Inspector Vane's death dawned crisp and clear, with autumn mist clinging to the village green like a shroud of unspoken secrets. Miss Marple emerged from her cottage at precisely 8 o'clock, ostensibly to tend her late roses, but actually to observe the methodical activities of Superintendent Harper's investigation team. The cheerful bunting from yesterday's fete hung limp and somehow accusatory, while the cordoned copse stood as a stark reminder that their peaceful village had harbored violence. Her contemplation was interrupted by young Timothy Fortescue, who approached with the restless energy of someone carrying burdensome knowledge. Colonel Melkit's nephew possessed that particular combination of boredom and observation common to intelligent young men trapped in rural tranquility, but today his usual sullenness had been replaced by genuine disturbance. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, glancing toward the copse. "Might I speak with you about yesterday? Uncle dismisses my concerns as fanciful, but I noticed something peculiar when I discovered the inspector." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears with careful attention. "Indeed, Timothy, what sort of peculiarity?" "Well, I'd been watching Inspector Vane earlier, not spying exactly, but he seemed so purposeful about everything. When he headed toward the copse, claiming to admire bluebells that weren't there, I noticed someone else following at a considerable distance." "How very interesting. Could you identify this person?" Timothy's face flushed slightly. "That's the difficulty. I couldn't see clearly from the coconut shy. Just a figure moving between the trees, keeping well back. But when I found the inspector 20 minutes later, there was no one else about." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mild blue eyes sharpening with interest. "And you mentioned this to Superintendent Harper?" "I tried, but he seemed more concerned with whether I'd disturbed the scene. Uncle says civilians should avoid speculation." Timothy paused, then continued with growing confidence. "There was something else, though. The inspector's walking stick was missing that elegant one with the silver bird's head handle. He'd been carrying it all afternoon, but it wasn't anywhere near the body." This detail struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. She recalled Inspector Vane's distinctive walking stick quite clearly, remembering how it had drawn admiring comments from several ladies. A walking stick could certainly inflict the kind of head wound Dr. Haydock had described, yet its absence suggested either careful premeditation or hasty concealment by someone who understood its incriminating potential. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Superintendent Harper himself, emerging from the lamb and flag with the satisfied air of someone who had gathered useful intelligence. He acknowledged Miss Marple with respectful attention, having learned to value local observation during previous investigations. "Miss Marple," he said gravely, "I won't pretend your insights aren't valuable. Inspector Vane's notebook contained references to several village residents, though in a code we're still deciphering." "How very thorough of him," Miss Marple murmured. "One always thinks policemen must develop such careful habits." Harper nodded grimly. "We've confirmed he was investigating a series of thefts from country houses, small valuable items disappearing during social gatherings. The thief appeared to use such occasions to study houses and habits, striking later when families were away." Miss Marple considered this information while observing Mr. Endicott approaching across the green, his nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles more pronounced than usual. As he passed, that same distinctive amber cologne she had noticed yesterday lingered in the morning. Air, expensive, sophisticated, and quite unmistakable. "How very clever," she observed quietly, "when someone uses social gatherings to learn such intimate details about their neighbors' lives and possessions." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscured by the careful deceptions of someone who understood both human nature and the art of concealment. By late morning, Superintendent Harper's methodical investigation had uncovered several troubling details that cast the previous day's tragedy in an increasingly sinister light. The inspector's room at the Lamb and Flag yielded his missing notebook, discovered in a locked drawer and filled with coded initials and dates that corresponded to recent social gatherings in neighboring parishes. Mrs. Larkin, the landlady, He mentioned with nervous precision that Inspector Vane had received a visitor. Yesterday afternoon, someone tall and well-dressed, who had left behind that distinctive amber cologne clinging to the curtains. Dr. Haydock arrived at the vicarage with his preliminary medical findings, speaking quietly to Harper while Miss Marple arranged flowers with studied casualness nearby. The head wound, he explained, had been inflicted by something cylindrical and weighted, precisely consistent with a walking stick handle. More significantly, the angle suggested the inspector had been struck by someone shorter than himself, or by someone approaching from an elevated position while Vane was seated or kneeling. "Most interesting," murmured Miss Marple. Though her attention seemed focused on her chrysanthemums, how revealing such technical details can be about the nature of an encounter. The investigation's focus shifted decisively when a constable discovered physical evidence near the copse. Muddy footprints matching the distinctive tread of Julian Thorne's artist boots, and more damaging still, a silver-handled palette knife tucked beneath loose flagstones, its tip bearing suspicious stains. When questioned about his whereabouts during the critical 20 minutes, Thorne's nervous explanations about seeking better light for his paintings seemed increasingly inadequate. The village's reaction was swift and decisive. Colonel Melchett proclaimed the case solved, declaring that artistic temperaments inevitably led to violence when confronted with authority. Mrs. Price Ridley recalled Thorne's unsettling intensity with triumphant satisfaction, while even Clara Finch, who had seemed charmed by the painter's company, now spoke of his disturbing habit of appearing unexpectedly in quiet places. These outsiders, Mrs. Bantry observed with relief. One never knows what they might be capable of when cornered. Yet, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the investigation's convenient trajectory. While arranging her flowers, she had noticed several details that others overlooked. Julian Thorne smelled consistently of turpentine and tobacco, never of that expensive amber cologne that had appeared repeatedly in her observations. The palette knife, while potentially lethal, seemed an amateurish choice when Inspector Vane's own walking stick, still mysteriously missing, would have been far more effective. Moreover, she recalled Thorne's detached amusement at village social rituals, suggesting an observer rather than someone emotionally invested enough for passionate violence. His mention of Inspector Vane seeking reflection in the copse seemed oddly forthcoming for someone concealing guilt. As Harper prepared to escort Thorne to Much Benham for formal questioning, Miss Marple observed the painter's genuine bewilderment at the evidence against him. The footprints and palette knife created a compelling narrative, yet something about their convenient discovery troubled her deeply. In her experience, the most obvious solutions often masked the most cunning deceptions. "Such relief," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "when mysteries resolve themselves so neatly. Though I always think of my dear nephew Raymond, who once observed that the most dangerous criminals are those who understand exactly how innocent people behave when accused." Walking home past the cordoned copse, Miss Marple reflected on the amber cologne that had appeared at Inspector Vane's room, on her jam stall, and most recently near Mr. Endicott's nervous presence. Someone in their peaceful village possessed both the sophistication to conduct a careful deception and the ruthlessness to eliminate a threat to their activities. The case against Julian Thorne might satisfy official requirements, but Miss Marple's understanding of human nature suggested the real killer remained free, hidden behind a facade of respectability and growing confidence in their apparent success. That afternoon, while Julian Thorne sat in Much Benham's police station protesting his bewildered innocence, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office with the ostensible purpose of purchasing stamps. Mrs. Hartwell, the postmistress, possessed that invaluable combination of discretion and observation that made her an encyclopedia of local intelligence, particularly regarding the correspondence that revealed so much about people's true concerns. "Such a relief about that dreadful painter," Mrs. Hartwell declared, sorting parcels with brisk efficiency. "Though I must confess, Inspector Vane's presence here was hardly coincidental. He posted several official letters to Scotland Yard during his stay, and one to Lloyd's of London, most purposeful correspondence for someone supposedly on holiday. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully while examining the notice board. Indeed, one does wonder what brought him to our peaceful village so precisely when those peculiar thefts have been troubling neighbouring parishes. Exactly my thinking, Mrs. Hartwell agreed, lowering her voice conspiratorially. And that expensive cologne someone's been wearing lately, I noticed it again this morning when Mr. Endicott collected his correspondence. Quite sophisticated for our modest village, though I suppose solicitors must maintain certain professional standards. This confirmation of her observations strengthened Miss Marple's growing conviction about the amber cologne's significance. As she prepared to leave, Dr. Haydock emerged from his surgery with the troubled expression of someone wrestling with professional concerns. He acknowledged her with grave courtesy, then spoke quietly about matters weighing on his medical conscience. Miss Marple, the evidence troubles me more than I've admitted to Superintendent Harper. Inspector Vane's head wound, while certainly fatal, shows characteristics suggesting he was unconscious or incapacitated before the decisive blow. More significantly, his hands bore no defensive injuries, implying he trusted his attacker sufficiently to turn his back. They paused beside the war memorial, its weathered stone providing appropriate gravity for confidential discussion. Dr. Haydock explained that the positioning of the body seemed theatrical, suggesting either psychological disturbance or calculated misdirection designed to create a specific impression. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured, observing Mr. Endicott approaching from his office, that telltale tremor in his usually steady hands more pronounced than ever. One always thinks murderers must feel tremendous pressure after committing such acts, particularly when innocent people face suspicion for their crimes. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary constitutional, ostensibly to gather late berries but actually to examine the copse with methodical attention. The path leading into the woods remained damp and soft from recent rain, the kind that would cling persistently to footwear. Yet she recalled vividly the peculiar cleanliness of Inspector Vane's shoes, despite this muddy terrain, a detail that had troubled her from the moment she first observed the body. Her careful examination revealed additional inconsistencies. Small scuff marks on the oak tree's bark, too low for a violent struggle, suggested something had been leaned against it temporarily, then removed. The missing walking stick with its distinctive silver bird's head handle could have created such marks, while the killer arranged the scene with theatrical precision. Timothy Fortescue found her there, his earnest face bright with suppressed excitement. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about the timeline. If Inspector Vane left the Dahlia display at 4:30 and I discovered him 20 minutes later, there's precious little time for Thorne to commit murder and escape. Yet I distinctly remember Thorne showing Mrs. Price Ridley his sketches near the refreshment tent at 4:45. How very precise of you, Timothy. Well, I noticed particularly because Mr. Endicott asked me to post an urgent letter to London at just that moment. He seemed quite anxious about the timing. Miss Marple absorbed this information while observing the village's comfortable return to normalcy, its collective relief at identifying an outsider as the perpetrator. Yet, her understanding of human nature suggested the real killer remained free, hidden behind respectability and growing confidence in their apparent success. The pieces were arranging themselves with increasing clarity in her mind, though the complete picture awaited one final, crucial revelation. The following morning brought developments that would prove crucial to Miss Marple's understanding of Inspector Vane's murder. She had risen early to tend her garden when Mrs. Tremaine appeared at her gate, her usual composed elegance replaced by visible distress. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she accepted Miss Marple's invitation for tea, and her typically immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of a sleepless night. Miss Marple, I must confide something rather disturbing, Mrs. Tremaine began, declining the offered biscuits with uncharacteristic curtness. Yesterday evening, While tidying my garden after the dreadful events, I discovered Inspector Vane's walking stick hidden beneath my rhododendrons, the one with the distinctive silver bird's head handle that everyone had been wondering about. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. How very troubling, Mrs. Tremaine. Had you noticed anyone in your garden recently? That's precisely what concerns me. The stick was wrapped in what appears to be one of Mr. Endicott's grey scarves, though upon closer examination, the weave seems rather too fine for his typically modest purchases. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create this evidence. This revelation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the case's carefully orchestrated nature. The walking stick's placement in Mrs. Tremaine's garden suggested either an attempt to implicate her or the killer's desperate need for a temporary hiding place before permanent disposal. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Haydock's urgent arrival. His medical bag clutched tightly and his face bearing the grim expression of someone delivering serious news. Behind him stood young Timothy Fortescue, shifting nervously and clutching an envelope with obvious reluctance. Miss Marple, we've had another incident, Dr. Haydock announced without preamble. Mr. Endicott collapsed in his office last evening, apparently from severe nervous exhaustion. He's conscious but extremely agitated, muttering about letters and deadlines. Before losing consciousness, he pressed this envelope into Timothy's hands with urgent instructions to deliver it to Superintendent Harper. Miss Marple accepted the sealed envelope, noting immediately the familiar amber cologne that clung to the paper despite its journey through multiple hands. The handwriting showed distinct tremor, suggesting either medical distress or extreme emotional agitation. More significantly, she observed a small dark stain on one corner that resembled dried blood. "How very concerning," she murmured, examining the envelope more closely. "Did Mr. Endicott explain the urgency of this correspondence?" Timothy stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "He seemed terrified, Miss Marple. Kept saying someone was trying to destroy his reputation and that innocent people were suffering for his mistakes. He mentioned something about Inspector Vane discovering the truth about the thefts, and that time was running out." Mrs. Tremaine's sharp intake of breath was audible. "The thefts? Then Inspector Vane was indeed investigating those peculiar incidents in neighboring parishes?" Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "It appears so. Mr. Endicott's collapse coincides rather conveniently with the mounting evidence against Julian Thorne. One wonders whether guilt and fear have finally overwhelmed his constitution, or whether he's discovered something that threatens his own safety." Miss Marple rose to escort her visitors to the door, her mind racing through the implications of these revelations. The walking stick's strategic placement, Mr. Endicott's convenient collapse, and the letter bearing that telltale amber cologne all suggested someone was orchestrating events with theatrical precision. As she watched Dr. Haydock and Timothy depart for the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the killer's increasingly desperate measures. The evidence against Julian Thorne had been too convenient, too perfectly arranged to satisfy her understanding of human nature. Someone in their peaceful village possessed both the sophistication to conduct an elaborate deception and the ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed facade. The truth was emerging with inexorable persistence, though the killer's identity remained hidden behind a mask of respectability and growing desperation. Within the hour, Superintendent Harper arrived at Miss Marple's cottage bearing Mr. Endicott's confession letter, his expression grave with the weight of new revelations. The envelope's amber cologne had intensified during its journey, creating an almost overwhelming presence in Miss Marple's modest sitting room as Harper broke the wax seal with methodical precision. "The letter confirms our suspicions about the thefts," Harper began, settling into the offered chair with obvious fatigue. "Endicott admits to his involvement, but claims he was coerced through blackmail. Someone discovered his financial indiscretions and has been using that knowledge to manipulate him into increasingly dangerous actions." Miss Marple poured tea with characteristic calm while absorbing these revelations. The confession painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had begun shortly after Inspector Vane's arrival. Endicott described receiving anonymous notes demanding specific cooperation, providing information about clients' travel plans, handling stolen goods, and, most disturbingly, planting evidence to frame Julian Thorne for murder. Most illuminating, Miss Marple murmured, studying the letter's tremulous handwriting. Though one wonders how this mysterious correspondent discovered Mr. Endicott's vulnerabilities. Such intimate knowledge suggests either remarkable and investigative skills or someone with considerable access to his private affairs. Their discussion was interrupted by Clara Finch's unexpected arrival, her usually reserved demeanor replaced by urgent determination. Dr. Haydock's wife rarely involved herself in village controversies, but today she carried information that could no longer remain private. "Superintendent Harper," Clara announced breathlessly, "I must tell you about something I witnessed during the fete. While everyone was distracted by the inspector's death, I saw someone emerging from the copse by the back path, someone who was clearly avoiding observation." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful attention. "Indeed, Mrs. Finch. Could you identify this person?" "Mrs. Tremaine," Clara replied without hesitation. She was carrying what appeared to be Inspector Vane's walking stick and taking extraordinary care not to be seen. At the time, I assumed she was simply avoiding the commotion. But now, this revelation transformed Mrs. Tremaine's subsequent discovery of the walking stick from coincidence to calculated misdirection. Harper produced the grey cashmere scarf that had wrapped the weapon, its fine weave and lingering amber cologne suggesting expensive tastes rather than Mr. Endicott's typically modest purchases. The scarf bears a label from Hawtrey and Cole of Bond Street, Harper observed, examining the delicate fabric. They're known for scenting their merchandise with distinctive amber cologne, the same fragrance that's appeared repeatedly throughout this investigation. Before Miss Marple could respond, a constable arrived with urgent correspondence from Lloyd's of London. Inspector Vane's inquiries had finally yielded results. Mrs. Tremaine's pearl necklace had been recently revalued, with strong suspicions of paste substitution following a pattern observed in other country house thefts. "How very thorough of Inspector Vane," Miss Marple commented, studying the official correspondence. "One always notices when someone's jewelry clasp has been recently disturbed, particularly when the owner is typically so meticulous about such details." As if summoned by their discussion, Mrs. Tremaine appeared in the cottage doorway, her usual elegant composure intact despite the circumstances. She moved with characteristic grace, though Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her gloved hands and the careful way she positioned herself near the exit. "I understand my name has been mentioned," Mrs. Tremaine said pleasantly, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "Surely you don't suppose I would involve myself in such sordid affairs as theft and blackmail?" Harper gestured toward the available chair with professional courtesy. "We'll need a statement about your movements yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Tremaine, and perhaps an explanation for your pearl's recent evaluation." Mrs. Tremaine's smile remained perfectly controlled, though Miss Marple detected the minute calculation behind her eyes, the look of someone weighing options and measuring risks with practiced precision. The pieces were finally arranging themselves into their true pattern, revealing a killer of remarkable sophistication hidden behind a facade of respectability. Mrs. Tremaine settled into the offered chair with characteristic grace, though Miss Marple observed how she positioned her handbag within easy reach and kept her gloved hands carefully folded. The amber cologne that had haunted this investigation now seemed almost overwhelming in the modest sitting room, its expensive sophistication at odds with the village's usual modest fragrances. "Superintendent Harper," Mrs. Tremaine began with admirable composure, "I fear there's been a terrible misunderstanding. My pearls were evaluated purely for insurance purposes following my late husband's estate settlement. As for the walking stick, I discovered it quite by accident while retrieving a dropped handkerchief. Harper consulted his notes methodically. Yet Mrs. Finch observed you carrying the weapon deliberately, taking considerable care to avoid detection. This hardly suggests innocent discovery. Mrs. Tremaine's laugh carried only the faintest strain. Dear Clara has always possessed such vivid imagination. Artists' wives often do, particularly under stress. Miss Marple poured fresh tea while noting the subtle scratch on Mrs. Tremaine's pearl clasp, a fresh disturbance on what was typically an immaculate ornament. The faint scent of beeswax clung to her gloves, that particular blend with lemon oil used by those who took exceptional pride in appearances. "How thoughtful of you to protect the evidence," Miss Marple murmured gently, wrapping Inspector Vane's walking stick so carefully in that expensive cashmere scarf. "Hawtrey and Cole of Bond Street, I believe?" The question struck home visibly. Tremaine's composure flickered before reasserting itself. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Miss Marple. The scarf belonged to poor Mr. Endicott." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Haydock's urgent arrival, his medical bag clutched tightly. "Superintendent, we have another incident. Mr. Endicott collapsed last evening, chloral poisoning, and a generous quantity. Someone interfered with my locked medicine cabinet." Harper's expression darkened. "Suicide attempt? The bottle shows careful manipulation, not force. Someone understands small mechanisms." Dr. Haydock displayed his keychain grimly. Before losing consciousness, Endicott managed to write something the letters H and C pressed deep into his blotter. Miss Marple studied Mrs. Tremaine's reaction carefully. The woman's controlled facade remained intact, though her breathing had grown slightly shallow. "Hawtrey and Cole," Harper observed meaningfully. "Or simply habit," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Solicitors do love their ampersands." Mrs. Tremaine rose with fluid elegance. "Gentlemen. Distressing, but I really must attend to some correspondence. Perhaps we could continue this discussion later." Harper gestured firmly toward her chair. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Tremaine. We'll need a complete statement about your movements yesterday." Miss Marple observed the minute calculation behind Mrs. Tremaine's eyes, the look of someone weighing increasingly desperate options. The amber cologne seemed to intensify with her rising tension, betraying the nervousness beneath her practiced control. "I always think," Miss Marple said conversationally, "how remarkable it is when someone possesses both the sophistication to orchestrate complex deceptions and the ruthlessness to silence inconvenient witnesses. Inspector Vane's investigation must have posed considerable threat to someone with so much to lose." Mrs. Tremaine's gloved hands tightened imperceptibly on her handbag's clasp. The psychological pressure was mounting with inexorable persistence, and her carefully constructed facade was beginning to show hairline cracks that would soon become irreparable fractures. The final confrontation was approaching, and Miss Marple's understanding of human nature told her that someone of Mrs. Tremaine's intelligence would soon realize that escape required more desperate measures than elegant denials. The psychological pressure in Miss Marple's sitting room intensified as Superintendent Harper methodically presented the accumulated evidence. Mrs. Tremaine maintained her elegant composure, though Miss Marple observed the subtle signs of strain, the minute tremor in her gloved hands, the careful positioning near the door, and most tellingly, the increasingly overwhelming presence of that distinctive amber cologne that seemed to intensify with her rising anxiety. Harper consulted Inspector Vane's recovered notebook, its coded entries now fully deciphered by Scotland Yard's experts. "The inspector documented a sophisticated operation," he announced, gravely, using social gatherings to catalogue valuable items, then arranging systematic theft when owners travelled abroad. The amber cologne appears repeatedly in his observations, always associated with one particular individual. Mrs. Tremaine's laugh carried a brittle edge. Inspector Vane possessed such an active imagination. One wonders how he distinguished between observation and fantasy. Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic gentleness. Indeed, though I always find that conscientious policemen develop such careful habits of documentation. The ribbon evidence, for instance. She produced a length of pale silk, bearing Hawtrey and Cole's distinctive crown mark. Inspector Vane pressed this into his notebook, taken perhaps from a parcel that bore your particular scent signature. The revelation about Julian Thorne's palette knife bearing only paint, not blood, had already eliminated the obvious suspect. 3 witnesses confirmed his presence at the refreshment tent during the crucial time frame, leaving Harper to focus on motives grounded in knowledge rather than passion. The pearl-clasp disturbance troubled me considerably. Miss Marple continued conversationally, her mild blue eyes never leaving Mrs. Tremane's face. Such careful attention to appearance, yet that recent scratching suggested hasty manipulation. Inspector Vane would have noticed such details during your conversation at the Dahlia display. Mrs. Tremane's grip on her handbag tightened visibly. Jewelry requires occasional adjustment, Miss Marple. Hardly evidence of criminal activity. Not in itself, dear, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. But when combined with other observations, the amber cologne on Mr. Endicott's confession letter, the cashmere fibers in your handbag, the Bond Street scarf wrapping Inspector Vane's walking stick patterns emerge that suggest careful orchestration rather than coincidence. Dr. Haydock spoke quietly from his position near the window. Mr. Endicott's blotter impression reads H and C. Quite clearly. Before the chloral took effect, he managed that final clue. Poor Mr. Endicott, Mrs. Tremaine murmured, though her voice had lost its earlier warmth. Such a nervous disposition, prone to flights of fancy when under pressure. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. Though I suspect his nervousness stemmed from specific knowledge rather than general anxiety. Someone discovered his financial vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically, suggesting that same someone possessed both intimate knowledge of village affairs and the sophistication to manipulate vulnerable individuals. The accumulated weight of evidence was creating visible cracks in Mrs. Tremane's elegant facade. Her breathing had grown shallow, and that telltale amber cologne seemed to pulse with her rising tension. When she rose abruptly from her chair, the movement carried none of her usual fluid grace. "You have no actual proof," she declared, her cultured voice betraying the first hint of strain. "Circumstantial observations and coincidental fragrances hardly constitute evidence of murder." Harper leaned forward with professional interest. "Perhaps not individually, Mrs. Tremaine, but Inspector Vane's notebook contains specific references to paste jewelry substitutions, and Lloyd's of London has confirmed suspicious patterns in your insurance valuations." The mention of her financial affairs struck home visibly. Mrs. Tremaine's eyes flashed with genuine anger, replacing her practiced disdain. "My private arrangements are hardly your concern, Superintendent. When they involve systematic theft and blackmail, they become very much our concern," Harper replied firmly. "Particularly when someone proves willing to commit murder to protect their secrets." Mrs. Tremaine took an involuntary step backward, her hands clenching and unclenching with nervous energy. The carefully constructed web of deception was unraveling thread by thread, and her desperate glances toward the door revealed the growing panic beneath her sophisticated exterior. Miss Marple observed these developments with the patient attention of someone who understood that even the most accomplished criminals eventually betrayed themselves through unconscious gestures. The final confrontation was approaching, and Mrs. Tremaine's composure was cracking under the inexorable pressure of accumulated truth. The amber cologne hung heavy in the air like an accusation, while the silence stretched taut with unspoken confessions waiting to emerge. The psychological pressure in Miss Marple's sitting room reached its crescendo as she employed her most delicate stratagem. Setting down her teacup with characteristic gentleness, she produced 2 handkerchiefs from her knitting bag with the air of someone seeking innocent advice. "Mrs. Tremaine, might I trouble you for your expertise? These were left after yesterday's unfortunate events, and I'm quite at a loss to identify their owners." She offered the first handkerchief with mild curiosity. "One carries a rather distinctive scent, while the other seems quite ordinary." Mrs. Tremaine accepted the first handkerchief with automatic grace, breathing delicately. "Common bay rum," she pronounced with confident authority. "The sort available at any village barber." Miss Marple nodded approvingly before offering the second. Mrs. Tremaine lifted it with practiced elegance, then inhaled more deeply as the unmistakable amber richness rose to meet her. "Hawtrey and Cole," she declared without hesitation. "Their signature number 12 blend." "How remarkably knowledgeable," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "The unscented handkerchief, you see, came from Inspector Vane's washstand at the Lamb and Flag. The amber-scented one was discovered in most peculiar circumstances, pressed between the pages of Mr. Endicott's confession letter." A flicker of calculation crossed Mrs. Tremaine's eyes, swiftly veiled, but not quickly enough to escape Miss Marple's patient observation. "Then the inspector must have been very near someone wearing that particular cologne," she said lightly, realizing a heartbeat too late the intimacy her words implied. Superintendent Harper allowed the silence to perform its inexorable work, while Mrs. Tremaine's breathing grew noticeably shallow. The amber cologne seemed to pulse with her rising anxiety, filling the modest sitting room with its accusatory presence. "Poor Mr. Endicott rallied briefly this morning," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Dr. Haydock mentioned he regained consciousness at precisely 10 minutes past 8. "8:30, Mrs. Tremaine corrected automatically, then caught herself with visible alarm as the words escaped her lips. Harper's pencil paused meaningfully. "We hadn't announced the specific time of his recovery, Mrs. Tremaine." "A natural mistake," she replied too quickly, her cultured voice carrying the first hint of strain. Miss Marple smoothed an invisible crease in her skirt. "Quite understandable under such circumstances. Memory betrays us all, eventually. My nephew Raymond once insisted that walking sticks with weighted silver heads couldn't possibly unscrew, yet many do precisely that to permit small concealed compartments." Mrs. Tremaine's chin lifted with defensive pride. "If you're suggesting Inspector Vane's walking stick concealed anything significant, you'll be disappointed in your speculation." "How reassuring to hear," Miss Marple murmured, noting the minute twitch at the corner of Mrs. Tremaine's mouth that betrayed knowledge she shouldn't possess. Harper produced Inspector Vane's final piece of evidence with deliberate ceremony, a photograph bearing yesterday's timestamp, showing Mrs. Tremaine's pearl necklace with unmistakable clarity. The inspector documented everything methodically, including the distinctive characteristics of genuine pearls versus paste substitutions. The photograph struck home with devastating accuracy. Mrs. Tremaine's elegant facade cracked visibly as she stared at the incriminating evidence. Her gloved hands trembled against her handbag's clasp, while that overwhelming amber cologne seemed to betray every secret she had fought to conceal. "You understand nothing about necessity," she declared, her voice breaking with accumulated strain. "My husband's debts required desperate measures that respectable society would never comprehend." Miss Marple observed this partial confession with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed countless human revelations. Indeed, though Inspector Vane discovered something far more serious than financial desperation, systematic theft, and the manipulation of poor Mr. Endicott through his vulnerabilities. Mrs. Tremaine's shoulders sagged as the weight of inevitable exposure settled upon her. The amber cologne hung heavy in the air like a signature of guilt, while her desperate glances toward the door revealed the growing panic beneath her sophisticated exterior. "It was survival," she whispered, her elegant mask finally slipping away completely. Harper rose with professional efficiency. "Mrs. Tremaine, you're under arrest for the murder of Inspector Geoffrey Vane." The silence that followed Superintendent Harper's arrest announcement stretched like a taut wire until Mrs. Tremaine's elegant composure finally shattered. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitable exposure, and the amber cologne that had betrayed her throughout seemed to pulse with her rising desperation. When she spoke, her cultured voice carried the brittle edge of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling beyond repair. "You cannot possibly understand the circumstances," she declared, her gloved hands trembling against her handbag. "My husband's debts would have destroyed everything: the house, my position, my very identity. Those insurance investigators were closing in from every direction." Miss Marple observed this psychological collapse with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed countless human revelations. Indeed, though Inspector Vane's investigation threatened more than financial exposure, he discovered the systematic nature of your operations, didn't he? "Operations," Mrs. Tremaine laughed bitterly. "Such a clinical term for survival. I simply used social gatherings to identify valuable items, then arranged for their acquisition when families traveled abroad. No one was physically harmed until that insufferable policeman began connecting patterns." The confession emerged with chilling clarity. Mrs. Tremaine had manipulated Mr. Endicott through his gambling debts, using anonymous letters to ensure his cooperation in handling stolen goods and providing alibis. Her social position granted perfect access to travel plans and valuable possessions, while her sophisticated understanding of human nature made her manipulation devastatingly effective. Inspector Vane was so methodical, she admitted with grudging respect. Following me to gatherings, photographing my jewelry, documenting every detail. When he approached me at the Dahlia display, I knew he had gathered sufficient evidence for prosecution. Miss Marple poured fresh tea with characteristic calm. "He offered you leniency, didn't he? The chance to return items before formal charges. That's why he suggested meeting privately in the copse." "He had such kind eyes," Mrs. Tremaine whispered, her voice breaking. "He trusted me completely, turned his back to examine some fabricated evidence while I struck him with his own walking stick. The silver head unscrewed, revealing the weighted handle. The irony seemed rather appropriate." Harper consulted his notebook grimly. "Then you arranged the body theatrically, planted evidence against Julian Thorne, and attempted to poison Mr. Endicott when his confession threatened your deception." "Poor Endicott was becoming hysterical," Mrs. Tremaine replied coldly. "His nervous collapse would have exposed everything. The chloral was meant to appear as suicide from guilt." Miss Marple studied this transformation from elegant socialite to calculating killer with the fascination of someone who understood human nature's darker complexities. "The amber cologne proved most revealing, my dear. Such distinctive fragrance leaves unmistakable traces on everything you touched. Inspector Vane's curtains, Mr. Endicott's confession letter, even my jam stall when you drew that raffle ticket." "Vanity," Mrs. Tremaine acknowledged with rueful honesty. "I couldn't abandon the small luxuries that defined my identity, even when they became evidence against me." As Harper prepared the formal procedures, Mrs. Tremaine gathered her handbag with automatic dignity. The amber cologne that had haunted this investigation now seemed almost pathetic in its desperate attempt to preserve respectability. "It was necessity," she insisted one final time, though her voice carried little conviction. "My husband's legacy couldn't be destroyed by his financial indiscretions." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held both compassion and inexorable judgment. "I dare say necessity wears many faces, dear. But murder is always ill-fitting, regardless of the circumstances that seem to justify it." As the constables escorted Mrs. Tremaine away, her elegant facade finally stripped bare, Miss Marple reflected on how desperate circumstances could transform respectable individuals into calculating killers. The truth had emerged through careful observation and psychological pressure, revealing the dangerous depths hidden beneath social pretensions. The investigation was complete, though its implications would resonate through Street Mary Mead's peaceful community for months to come. As the constable's footsteps faded down Miss Marple's garden path, the cottage settled into contemplative silence. The overwhelming presence of amber cologne gradually dissipated, leaving behind familiar scents of lavender and beeswax that spoke of peaceful domesticity rather than calculated deception. Superintendent Harper remained seated, processing the psychological complexities of a case that had nearly condemned an innocent man while allowing a sophisticated killer to maintain her elegant facade. The clean shoes were the decisive clue, Miss Marple explained gently, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. Inspector Vane could not have walked that muddy path to die so tidily against the oak. He was struck elsewhere, likely on the drained grass behind the tea tent, then arranged among the leaves with theatrical precision. Harper nodded grimly. The walking stick's silver head unscrewed to reveal the weighted handle, and you noticed the beeswax scent on her gloves from polishing away evidence. Indeed, Mrs. Tremaine understood manipulation, but underestimated how small details betray larger deceptions. The amber cologne was both her signature and her downfall, appearing on every surface she touched, from Inspector Vane's curtains to Mr. Endicott's confession letter. News of the arrest traveled through Street Mary Mead with wildfire swiftness, leaving shock and disbelief in its wake. Mrs. Bantry found herself recalling subtle inconsistencies in Mrs. Tremaine's demeanor, while Colonel Melchett grumbled about having to recant his pronouncements regarding Julian Thorne's guilt. The painter was released from Much Benham that afternoon, bewildered but profoundly relieved, though he departed the village the following morning with understandable eagerness to escape associations with violence and false accusations. Mr. Endicott recovered under Dr. Haydock's watchful care, his gratitude to Miss Marple evident despite his shame at being manipulated through gambling debts. The chloral poisoning had failed in its lethal purpose, leaving him alive to provide crucial testimony about Mrs. Tremaine's systematic exploitation of his vulnerabilities. She possessed remarkable intelligence, Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry over evening tea. Yet intelligence without moral foundation becomes merely sophisticated selfishness. The village attempted to return to its accustomed rhythms, but an undeniable unease persisted. Mrs. Tremaine's systematic exploitation of social gatherings had corrupted the foundation of community trust, transforming innocent conversations about travel plans and valuables into intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. Every polite smile now carried hints of suspicion. Every casual conversation held silent questions about hidden secrets. Miss Marple understood this lingering disquiet as the natural consequence of shattered illusions. People would learn to trust again, but Inspector Vane's murder and Mrs. Tremaine's betrayal would serve as permanent, unspoken cautionary tales about the dangerous currents flowing beneath surfaces of respectability. Clara Finch, who had bravely provided crucial testimony about witnessing Mrs. Tremaine's suspicious behavior, felt vindication tinged with sadness for the woman she had once admired. Timothy Fortescue expressed his uncle's gratitude for preventing a terrible miscarriage of justice, his earnest observations having proved essential to the truth. As autumn deepened toward winter, Miss Marple spent her afternoons knitting by the window, her mild blue eyes observing the subtle shifts in village behavior. She noted the renewed intensity with which some residents guarded their privacy, the slight hesitations in greetings, the careful way people now evaluated social invitations. The bunting from the fateful fete had finally been removed, though its cheerful memory seemed forever tainted by association with murder. In her garden, Miss Marple tended her late roses while reflecting on human nature's capacity for both remarkable kindness and calculated cruelty. Inspector Vane's case had been solved through psychological understanding rather than scientific evidence, proving once again that the most sophisticated crimes were ultimately betrayed by their perpetrators' unconscious habits. The amber cologne would linger in memory long after its physical presence faded, serving as a reminder that even the most elegant deceptions eventually revealed their true nature through accumulated small betrayals of character and conscience. Winter descended upon Street Mary Mead with the quiet persistence of accumulated wisdom, transforming the village green, where Inspector Vane had died, into a pristine landscape that seemed to absolve the earth of its violent secrets. 3 months had passed since Mrs. Tremane's trial and imprisonment, yet the psychological reverberations continued to shape the community in ways both subtle and profound. Miss Marple observed these changes during her daily constitutional, noting how conversations still carried undertones of wariness. Though the initial shock had mellowed into something approaching acceptance, the trust that had once flowed naturally between neighbors now required conscious cultivation, like tending a garden damaged by frost but slowly returning to health through patient care. A small parcel had arrived from Scotland Yard's property office, containing items recovered after Mrs. Tremane's confession. A single paste pearl matching her necklace's substitution. A narrow ribbon stamped with Hawtrey and Cole's crown. And most poignantly, the threaded cap from Inspector Vane's walking stick. Even wrapped in official paper, it carried the faintest whisper of that amber cologne that had betrayed so many secrets. Mr. Endicott had recovered both his health and professional reputation, the community having rallied around him with characteristic determination to forgive those who had been victimized rather than those who had victimized others. His gambling debts had been quietly settled through discreet arrangements, allowing him to rebuild his practice without the shadow of desperation that had made him vulnerable to manipulation. Clara Finch had emerged from the experience with unexpected confidence. Her crucial testimony having established her as someone whose observations carried weight in village affairs. She continued her painting with deeper introspection, as if witnessing hidden darkness had inspired new artistic depths. Young Timothy Fortescue often sought out Miss Marple for quiet conversations, finding in her subtle wisdom a guide for understanding human complexity. Julian Thorne had written from London, expressing gratitude for her intervention and describing his renewed appreciation for artistic communities where eccentricity was celebrated rather than suspected. His brief imprisonment had paradoxically enhanced his reputation, lending romantic persecution that attracted both collectors and critics to his subsequent exhibitions. Dr. Haydock encountered Miss Marple on the lane one crisp afternoon, matching her pace as they walked past Mrs. Tremane's shuttered house. "When did you know?" He asked, without preamble. "Truly no. Beyond suspicion. When everyone preferred the easy relief of Mr. Thorne," she replied thoughtfully. "Clean shoes in mud, bluebells out of season, and a scent that belonged neither to painters nor village barbers. A lady who wraps evidence in expensive fragrance forgets that merchants perfume more than their goods, they perfume their very identity." Scotland Yard had commended Inspector Vane's thorough documentation, noting how his methodical approach had provided the foundation for successful prosecutions even after his death. His investigation had exposed a sophisticated operation extending far beyond street Mary Mead, leading to the recovery of numerous stolen items and dismantling similar schemes in neighboring counties. As spring approached, Miss Marple contemplated the cyclical nature of human experience. The village green would soon host another fete, complete with bunting and charitable stalls. Yet everyone would remember the autumn afternoon when such innocent pleasures had been interrupted by calculated violence. This memory would not prevent future celebrations, but it would add layers of appreciation for genuine kindness. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on a blanket for the church charity drive, her mild blue eyes observing the gradual return of natural rhythms to village life. The amber cologne had faded from immediate consciousness, though it remained filed away with other details that had proved crucial to understanding human nature's capacity for both remarkable deception and ultimate self-betrayal. She reflected that evil rarely arrived like thunder. It came scented, polished, and smiling, trusting that no one looked closely at clean shoes, missing bluebells, or the way pearl clasps sat against elegant throats. Miss Marple looked closely. That was all. It was enough.